Excellencies, distinguished speakers, and dear participants, welcome to this third and last webinar organized within UNCTAD's online course on trade negotiation techniques. My name is Ebru Gökçe Desmon, and I'll be your moderator today. I would like to give the floor to my director, Ms. Luz Maria de la Mora, to deliver her opening remarks. Luz Maria, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ebru. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It is a great honor and a privilege to be here with you today. Excellencies, distinguished speaker, dear participants. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar that has been organized within UNCTAD's online course on trade negotiation and techniques. As we all know, trade remains a very important policy instrument for sustainable economic growth and development, for job creation, for the economic activity of each and every country in this world. But trade policy making and trade negotiations also represent a daunting challenge for governments within the current trade dynamics that are unfortunately being affected deeply by geopolitical tensions, unilateral measures, rising protectionism, new industrial policies, global energy transition efforts, or even how to make trade more inclusive. So the scenario is challenging, complicated, but also requires all of our creativity and ingenuity. So reaping effective development benefits from participation in the multilateral trading system, but also coping with the increasing number of bilateral, regional, subregional, and plurilateral trade integration processes remains a big challenge for national policymakers and trade negotiators, and especially those that are coming, like me, from developing countries. This online course aims precisely to that, to strengthen the negotiation capacity of trade officials in developing countries. And we have prepared this seminar today to help all of those that are participating here today and who have their responsibilities, trade negotiations, and their implementation as part of their agenda. So we really hope that this workshop will be of use. Today's session will focus on coordination in preparing and conducting negotiations and in implementing the resulting agreements once negotiations are concluded. We always focus a lot on the process, the content of the negotiation, and sometimes we tend to forget that what we agree to has also to be implemented. Trade negotiations have become complex as they include beyond the border issues, and also because they involve many stakeholders at the national, regional, subnational, and also at the international level. So there is a real intermingle between different actors at different levels, and we all have to consider them. Often negotiators spend more time consulting domestically, that is to say, negotiating at home with stakeholders, than actually negotiating with their trading partners at the international level or at the negotiation table, as we like to say. So internal coordination and consultation with all stakeholders is key for preparing well for negotiations. An additional challenge for government officials is how to implement agreements once they have been negotiated, once the agreements have signed, once we have the handshake, once we are all very happy because we came up with an agreement, then it has to be ratified or approved in each one of the legislatures, and then it's time to put it in place, to implement it. So this has become challenging over the decades because of the coverage of trade agreements. Today, agreements not only include market access, that is to say, the elimination of tariffs and measures at the border as they relate to customs, but they include many more areas of concern. For example, new areas in the trade agenda that are related to environmental measures, to human rights, to labor conditions, or even new issues on the agenda that relate, for example, to the digital economy or regulatory aspects, or how to come up with the right regulations, the process of regulations. So the number of provisions and how they relate to domestic regulations is growing as the economy is becoming, on one hand, more complex, but on the other hand, as integration deepens into new areas of policy making, but also to the extent that integration is deeper among countries. So that is why we thought that it would be good to focus on these two issues in today's webinar. I have the great honor and the great privilege to welcome His Excellency Mr. Guillermo Valles to this webinar. In addition to being an UNCTAD permanent member of the UNCTAD family, Mr. Valles is a former director of UNCTAD's trade division. He has had a very distinguished career as an Uruguay diplomat. He had served as ambassador of Uruguay in Geneva and was the chairperson of the WTO negotiating group on rules that dealt with subsidies and trade remedies, including fishery subsidies. And I personally am very grateful to have Ambassador Valles today, who is also a good friend of mine from way behind when I was a trade negotiator for Mexico and he was a trade negotiator for Uruguay. So Ambassador Valles, it is a great honor and a great privilege to have you with us today. Thanks for accepting to share all of your experience with this group today. I also would like to welcome Professor David Luke and my dear colleague, Ms. Jin-Kung Koo. I appreciate your participation in today's seminar. Professor Luke was deeply involved in the construction of what has become the African Continental Free Trade Area, and Jung was engaged in the Republic of Korea's FTA negotiations with the United States, among other negotiations. So you have a splendid group of collaborators. I also want to acknowledge, recognize, and thank Professor Craig Van Grastek for always being with us in these very exciting seminars that we hope will be very useful to all of those that are here today with us today. So once again, I want to thank our speakers for being with us and wish you a very fruitful discussion. So without further ado, I give the floor back to Ebru. Thank you, Ebru.
Thank you very much, Luzma, for opening our session today, for being with us. Now I'd like to give you some information on course participation. We are in the 6th week of the course and we have over 540 registered participants from 100 countries, a large majority of which are developing countries. Out of 369 participants who replied to the questionnaire on the course platform, we have 56% female in the course, 43.5% male, and 0.5% non-binary participation. And 1% of participants define themselves as a person with a disability. As for professional profile, we have 74% from government or other public institutions, mostly ministries of trade and foreign affairs, 9% from the private sector, 2% from civil society, 9% from universities, and 3% UN staff. As for backgrounds of participants, we have 34% economics, 17% international relations, 15% law, 4% political science, and 30% from other fields. 26% of participants have already taken an online course provided by UNCTAD. We have originally developed these courses in English. We are aware of the need to make these courses available in French, which is the second working language of the United Nations Secretariat. We are planning to translate these courses into French once we have the necessary resources to do so. I have received some messages and requests on the subject, so I thought it's useful to mention it here. And I would like to remind our course participants who are with us today in the webinar that if you complete all the modules, pass all the quizzes, and complete the evaluation survey, you will receive a certificate signed by our director, Luz Maria. Please do complete the evaluation survey, which will be open after this webinar. Your feedback is important for us to improve our courses. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers to you in more detail. We have an excellent panel of speakers with us, and my director has already presented them to you shortly. But let me go through their detailed bio information. We have the honor to have with us His Excellency Mr. Guillermo Valles Galmes. He's a career Uruguayan diplomat with over 40 years of professional experience. He's currently the ambassador of Uruguay to Brazil. He has served in multiple multilateral and bilateral domestic diplomatic posts in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and the United Nations. He was Uruguay's ambassador to China, in the European Union, Belgium, and before the WTO and United Nations in Geneva. He was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as Luzma mentioned, he was the director of UNCTAD's Division on International Trade and Commodities between 2011 and 2017. I had the privilege to work with Guillermo during his time at UNCTAD, but also before that, when I was part of the Turkish delegation joining the rules negotiations at the WTO, he was chairing the rules negotiation committee, so I also worked in that setting with him, so it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, His Excellency, for accepting our invitation and joining us today. We have the pleasure of having Professor David Luke with us. Mr. David Luke is Professor in Practice and Strategic Director at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at London School of Economics and Extraordinary Professor at Northwest University in South Africa. Specializing in African trade policy and trade negotiations, Professor Luke has decades of experience in policy advisory services, managing and catalyzing research, building partnerships, training and capacity development for private sector and governments. He has worked with the African Union, the UN Development Programme, and the Economic Commission for Africa with postings in Harare, Pretoria, Geneva, and Addis Ababa. At ECA's African Trade Policy Center, Professor Luke and his team were instrumental in the preparation of the protocols that make up the African Continental Free Trade Agreement today. Our last speaker will be my colleague, Ms. Jin-Kyung Koo. Jin-Kyung is a government official of Republic of Korea, and she is currently seconded to UNCTAD as an expert. She specialized in trade negotiations and international relations. With about 20 years of experience as a trade official, she has played a key role in trade negotiations, particularly with the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. Her work has also focused on bilateral trade relations with North American countries, as well as the implementation of trade agreements with countries such as Canada, United States, and Vietnam. She has also been actively involved in her country's preliminary consultations aiming to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Thank you for being with us today, Jin-Kyung. And I thank once again to our three speakers for being with us today. And of course, we have with us, as usual, our course instructor and today's discussant, Professor Craig van Grastek. Craig is a trade consultant and former adjunct lecturer at John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. Craig has written a lot on trade policy and the WTO. He has 40 years of experience working with UNCTAD and a lot of experience in advising developing countries on trade policy. On the course platform, you have more detailed bio of Craig with links to his books if you would like to know more about him. So on the running of the session today, after speakers' interventions, we will have, if we have time, we will have a Q&A session where you can ask questions to speakers. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box. And if we have time, we will go through them. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor first to His Excellency, Mr. Valles. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Ebru. First of all, and as a matter of or organization, how many minutes or hours or days do I have?
10 minutes for the initial intervention.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. David, Luke, lovely to see you as well. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing before Madame Ku, but I'm surrounded by friends, so this will be a very easy task, and I hope a dialogue between us, since we have not seen David for a long time, and I think even by a conversation between us, it could be a good, perhaps a good lesson for the participants. Look, my first reflections is when we speak about coordination, and as Luz Maria very correctly said, uh, coordination, it's more difficult. It's the most difficult function in a negotiation because it's actually negotiating with your people back in home. And the very first element, I would say, it's that usually negotiators, and I'm talking as a career diplomat, we face the problem that you have to coordinate with regulators, and regulators by themselves, they are not negotiators. They might have been involved in some domestic negotiations in terms of understanding the reality that they have to regulate. But once they have reached that point and they have to manage and implement rules that they develop themselves, or that the parliamentarians, if they are laws, then their mindset, it's to defend what they have, the rules that they have to apply, and therefore even the education, the mindsets of the regulators, it's completely different from the training that an international negotiator has. So it's, let's make it simple. It's a international negotiator sort of uh, trying to find the flexibilities around a very close mindset that you have from a psychological. I'm sort of reflecting on the psychology. That has been at least my experience and tradition since we came. I started being a trade negotiator in the 70s. So, of course, that has changed because regulators now are educated, are brought up and educated in a more globalized world. But, but if we see what we have in front of us now, today, and what we probably have in the coming years, it will be a sort of deglobalization drive, so to speak. And I wonder what would be that mindset of those regulators with which we have to negotiate domestically. It's a big challenge ahead as we are as the paradigm shift that we are focusing having in front of our eyes uh, will bring some effects internally. So I'm reflecting on the challenges of coordinating in the past, in the present, and perhaps in the future. Uh, so second element, it's not only a different mindset. The negotiator, an international negotiator, of course, depending on the hierarchy and the responsibilities that you are taking, if you are the general coordinator or if you are a specific coordinator for some issues, um, that makes a difference indeed. But I would say that there is usually in all the countries in the world this question about where does authority remain? And Craig Van Grastek has studied this for many years, and in particular, I recommend very strongly this book. I have it at hand because I'm just about to to move out of Brazil, so I'm packing, and I have this Bible of mine, as some other books of Craig, very close. And this question of the negotiating authority is absolutely crucial, and it's not clear in many cases. In the instance, for example, of Uruguay, it's very clear. It's an executive power, but where does that authority fall? And this gets into something that we have discussed for many times with Miho in past years. Trade negotiations are part of economic policy. And at the same time, it applies, so to speak, in an international environment. So it relates to foreign relations as well. So that tension, to put it very mildly and very simple, in a very simple case, you have other tensions, but broadly speaking, you have this. Is it a matter of trade policy? Is it a matter of economic policy? Or is it a matter for foreign policy? And then the next challenge comes. Where does that authority remain? The US, for quite some time, not anymore, I would say, Craig, has sort of partially solved the situation by building up the USTR, the representative of the president. But the tensions also remain, because where does that authority fall? In terms of the United States, my understanding was, and I underline, Craig, was the Congress of the United States. So sort of the coordination also encompassed, in the case of the United States, certainly the congressmen and particularly the certain bodies in the Congress. So it's very difficult, and this is to sort of as a kickoff to start rounding my initial presentation. It's very difficult to speak about coordination in broad terms. It depends on what reality are you set in what sort of negotiation. It's completely different from a bilateral negotiation, a regional negotiation, a multilateral negotiation. It's quite different at the outset, but the very basics of having different and as Luz Maria was mentioning, these days, I mean, in the last, I would say, 20 years, the progress of the trade and other policy areas has been enlarging. All trade negotiations became trade and something, trade and environment, trade and human rights, trade and competition policy, trade and consumer policy, even nuclear affairs in some cases, as we all know. So that made the coordinating in the process of negotiation. Later on, we can speak about the implementation, which is not the link of this. But let me conclude this first intervention by saying that that complexity becomes even bigger when the negotiations take place over an extended period of time, a very extended period of time. I think the best case to explain this is the Mercosur European Union negotiations. Which have taken, are still taking more than 25 years. And I would make the case for that these negotiations have been for over 35 years. Um, and of course, during an extended period of time, issues change, policy orientations might change, but most importantly, people change again. So the whole teams of the coordinators and the coordinate the bodies being sort of coordinated also change. We will later discuss on possible remedies, possible mechanisms, but I would say from the outset, from the outset, one important thing is training, education, and training. Second element, in my view, it's the coordinator. If this is the main negotiator, the task of coordinating is almost helpless if the coordination it's not top down, if the ministers involved are not participant on a sort of vortex of coordination. The national coordinator, and I have been there in many times, it's executing. It's almost impossible, I would say. So that should include education, but a kind of top-down approach in terms of helping the negotiation process. I will round it up with that, Ebru, and ready to follow the conversation later on.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Valles. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Luke. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Ebru, and greetings to everyone online, of course, to Guillermo, an old friend for many, many years, and good to see you, Guillermo, but also new friends such as Louis Maria, whom I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, but I hope I would soon. But also Miho, with whom I go back many years also, and of course, Tai, and it's also good to meet you, Ebro. I'd also like to recognize Craig, and Craig also to let you know that I do use your manual, the UNCTAD manual, in my trade policy and development class that is taught in the School of Public Policy for the MPP students at LSE, and that's always gone well. I'm looking forward to an update of the manual, which I expect will be part of this process. Let me also just, in starting this intervention, to say I agree broadly with what has been said in Luis Maria's opening remarks and Guillermo's opening remarks as well. Especially given that we now live in a very complex world. The trade environment has become extremely complex. The recognized structures for trade negotiations are not actually working anymore. And I think, as we all know, things have become very transactional. So that poses a challenge to trade negotiations being conducted in a traditional way. And I think both Guillermo and Luis Maria touched on this. Then, of course, also the trade agenda is now quite broad because with all the trade and aspects and so on. But all the same, I think there's some principles that remain, and I think in the context of learning and teaching about trade negotiations, it's important to keep some principles in mind, which will not change even as the environment around us change and so on. So in thinking about this topic of coordination of trade negotiations and implementation of trade agreement, I think for me, the fundamental principle I'd like to speak to is one that already has been touched on. I'm not claiming credit or originality for this, but the way I would put it is that trade negotiations between countries are first and foremost negotiations within countries. And I think this touches on the points that Guillermo was making in regard to how coordination is very difficult, the role of policymakers, regulators, the trade negotiating authority, and so on. But I think if we look at this as sort of two-tier negotiations that are going on simultaneously within countries and between the parties, the international parties, then I think it provides a framework to also try to understand some of the challenges, especially, I'm speaking here particularly from an African point of view, to understand some of the challenges in regard to capacities, in regard to short-term interests, in regard to long-term interests, in regard to working within coalitions, then also within coalitions, sometimes having to compromise on interests and so on. So all of this becomes quite complex when you look at it from that point of view. But let me just try to illustrate some of these issues by just looking back very, very briefly, obviously, at some negotiations in which African countries have been involved in. And I'll, sort of do it very quickly. I'll, highlight some aspects of multilateral negotiations, regional negotiations, and bilateral negotiations. Multilaterally, in the context of the WTO, the African countries typically work within coalitions, whether it's the African group itself as the primary coalition, but also other groups, whether it is the LDC group, the ACP group, the Small Vulnerable Economies group, the G90, and so on. There are, of course, benefits working within coalitions, especially when capacities are stretched or limited, and when the interests are broadly aligned. But there should be no mistake that even within coalitions, there are compromises, there are aspects that are specific to certain countries or even certain groups within a coalition that cannot be fully addressed by the coalition. But nonetheless, these get lost within the coordination. So within the coalition. So this is one of the challenges of coordination. Of course, this kind of coordination helps with capacity challenges, but it also means that from an individual country perspective, it may not be entirely satisfactory. And then also, it also means that these regulators and policymakers and negotiating authorities that Guillermo was talking about back home, who are waiting to see what is coming out of all of this, are not necessarily satisfied with the outcome. And even from the point of view of negotiators themselves, will not be satisfied with the outcome. And I think you can see this in many aspects, in many ways, in the WTO discussions and so on, looking back over the last 20, 25 years and all that. So I think you have that kind of challenge. Then, of course, also within this prism, short-term aspects, even tactical aspects, and the longer-term issues. My own view is that development challenges have not really been addressed in the kind of fundamental way that they need to be addressed, in the context of the multilateral trading system, WTO negotiations. I think also that for the poor left behind countries, the poorest countries, really the multilateral trading system has not delivered for them as such. Nonetheless, just given the unpredictability and power politics and all that attends international trade, it is still in the interest of small countries, poor countries, to as best as they can participate in the multilateral system, because at least it gives them some predictability. It gives them some certainty to the extent at which we can think of certainty these days, but some degree of predictability, and if you like, protection to some extent. All these terms I'm using are relative because things are moving so fluidly in today's world. But nonetheless, I still teach that the WTO is relevant, and small countries in particular should, to the best they can, continue to engage in the WTO. But again, all these challenges that I've mentioned. Now, when it comes to regional trade negotiations, and the AFCFTA is a good example of this. Again, political objectives, broad political objectives, desire to address some structural problems in the African context, small economies. The median African economy is only about, output is only about 16 billion. That is really very small, so makes regional integration an imperative for development among African countries to achieve scale, to achieve competitiveness, really to attract investment in any substantial way, to deal with structural constraints on the economy and so on. So you can tick all those boxes. Regional integration remain important. The political backing for this is very strong, as we have seen in the AFCFTA and negotiations and so on. Now, these negotiations also were approached typically in the form of coalitions with the existing regional groupings leading in the negotiations, providing technical support to individual countries within their groupings and so on. Again, helpful in terms of addressing capacity constraints and so on, but it also does mean that this aspect of engagement at home, that there's something lost there. So now that the FCFTA has been negotiated, we are seeing challenges with implementation, because at home, the prior negotiations, the onboarding and the consensus building, it's not been as robust as one would have wished. Of course, countries have their national implementation plans, but a weakness which is being pointed out as far as these national implementation plans are concerned is the absence of a strong private sector ownership, because at the end of the day, it's the private sector that has to use these agreements and so on. So again, something lost in aggregating the approach to the negotiations through regional coalitions and so on in the FCFTA context, but that prior negotiation at home to ensure that the capacities, that the policymakers, that everyone is fully on board, the private sector and so on. There's something also missing. Let me end with my last example, the bilateral negotiations. And here, typically, the most common one is being between African and the European Union. And here again, being approached in the form of coalitions, regional coalitions. Literally, the outcomes of these bilateral negotiations were regional economic partnership agreements, regional EPAs. Not quite satisfactory for all countries. So you've had a situation where some individual countries like Kenya, in the case of within the East African community, or Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana within the ECOWAS in West Africa, have had their own separate deals with the EU outside of the regional coalition, again reflecting these sorts of challenges that I've already highlighted. There are no easy solutions to these issues, so to say. But I'll just end with this thought, and that is that despite all the challenges and all the disconnect between what negotiators try to achieve and the situation back home, I would say that I've seen an increase in knowledge about the issues, the negotiating issues. I have seen an increase in the professionalization of negotiations, whether it's at the WTO level, at the regional level, or bilateral level. And I think this is the changes and these positive aspects a result of trial and error, trial and being involved, being engaged, and so on in all these different negotiations. But the point I'm making is that 25 years ago, the situation was far more desperate, less knowledge, less technical expertise about negotiations. But today, I think we're in a much better place, and all the more so just given the kind of world that we now find ourselves in. So let me stop here. Obviously, it's not possible to cover everything in the short time that we have, but I'll be happy to engage in discussions and to take questions and to clarify any point that I may not have explained properly. So once again, thank you, and back to you, Ebru. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Luke, and thank you for finishing on a positive note that we have seen an increase in knowledge and capacity in negotiation and negotiation skills. That is what we are trying to do today to contribute to that objective. I hope it's working. So I will turn to now our last speaker, Ms. Jingyan Ku. Jingyan, you have the floor. Thank you.
I'm sharing my slides first.
Yes, we can see
Is
them.
it good? Is it good?
Yes, very good.
Thank
Perfect.
you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ibru. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to present. Today, I'm going to talk about the implementation of trade agreements. The presentation will be composed of 3 parts. First, what is implementation and why does it matter? And third, how to implement. The first part is what is implementation? It's just a definition that I made for the purpose of this presentation. So I welcome if there are any academic definition. So please. So implementation is a process of putting the negotiated terms and conditions into effect. So as you can see in the picture, once legal texts are finalized and signed, the next step is implementation. So, and then the implementation part is divided largely into 2 parts. The first it is domestic procedures for ratification, and the second part is a monitoring and review. Actually, implementation is as crucial as negotiations and sometimes more challenging than negotiation. I'll give you an example of one of the Korea's FTA that with the US. As you can see here, it took 1 year from the commencement of official negotiation until the signing. However, it took 5 years, nearly 5 years for the agreement to enter into force. Then what happened during the 5 years? Over the 5 years period, first, the originally signed FTA underwent additional negotiations on several issues. And second, the FTA also faced intense domestic opposition, and Korean government had to have an intense outreach to domestic stakeholders. Korean government also reached out to US part to get a wide support from the across the US. As such, I'd like to say implementation process is kind of final stitch that completes the fabric of the FTA. Then why does implementation matter? I would say first, it is, yeah, of course, it is important because it is a legal commitment. Second, without proper implementation, the economic benefits that government aimed for cannot materialize. The second part is the economic reason. And third part, I think it is also very, very important. When agreements are successfully implemented and the projected economic beneficials are realized, then governments can gain broad support from stakeholders. So this support can then help government to further initiate another trade policies. So in short, the successful implementation can create kind of virtuous cycle when it comes to trade policies. So fourth, and there is no opportunity to gather feedback on trade agreements without implementation. Only through this, you can assess the agreement and identify the areas where modifications or improvements may be necessary. As such, implementation is crucial from legal, economic, and political perspectives. Second, then how to implement. I've made 5 key points, and I will explain in detail one by one. First, before you start implementation process, you have to review the agreement because the text itself tells you how to implement. I just want to make an example of the Korea-US FTA. In Korea's FTA, we have to first complete the legal requirements and domestically, and each part exchange written notification that certify that they completed their own domestic procedures. And then the agreement entered into force. And now you understand how to proceed with the process by reviewing the text itself. And then you are highly recommended that you understand both you and the other party. I would not touch upon the details how Korea and US different. I just wanted to highlight that legal systems can differ from country to country. So we have to understand that we are different. Yes, from the perspective of international law, yeah, it is obvious. Korea-US FTA is a treaty and which is binding upon both party. A party cannot, can I say, justify their internal law for its failure to commit the agreement. And as you already know, the Vienna Convention of Treaty of Law is very clear in this. However, it is the responsibility of government officials to assess the other party's readiness for ratification. In case of Korea's FTA, we held several rounds of consultation before we change written notification to ensure that each government domestic laws and regulations are aligned with the FTA. So next, once an agreement enters into force, then the next step is monitoring. As you can see in the slides, you can utilize many methods such as on-site visit, call center, regular meetings, and online platforms. You can use all of that. I recently learned that there is Africa Trade Observatory. There is a trade obstacles part. I think that could be a good example of using online platform in implementation. So, and that I'd like to emphasize that more important thing is that all complaints and feedbacks should be directed to a desk officer who is in charge of the FTA, where all the feedbacks systematically compiled. I think I would like to emphasize that. And the fourth, once you receive feedbacks from stakeholders, then you need to contact your counterpart and initiate consultations. Of course, depending on the urgency or relevance, you may reach out directly to your counterpart, but you can also use the institutional bodies, which is established under the FTA. As you can see, there are lots of committees or working parties in the FTAs, so you can use that. One important thing is, because there are lots of committees under the FTA, and different agencies are responsible for different committees. So it is very crucial that a focal point or national coordinator monitor the overall operation of the implementation bodies. So, for example, when an issue is arised and it's not addressed at a lower level, maybe at a committee, for example, in a trading goods, blah, 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 then when it is not resolved at that level, the national coordinator pick up this situation, then that issue can be escalated to the top level body, like ministerial committee, something like that. And lastly, but not least, it is vital to increase awareness and utilization. As I pointed out in the first slide, utilization is very important because without that, you cannot broaden your support from across your country. So it is very important. So you can open the text and read, and it's very difficult. It's kind of it's very difficult to decipher what that means and how we don't know how to navigate the next. So it is very important to make a one-stop and user-friendly kind of portal service where stakeholders get informations conveniently. And also promotions and capacity buildings and public-private partnerships, also very, very important. Before I stop, I just wanted to show the Korea's FTA portal, if it is possible. I'm sorry, it is in Korean, but I just wanted to touch upon how all the services can be in one portal. So first of all, you can search in the portal the export duties. Here, maybe it is a little bit slow. And you can also search the import duties as well. All the functions are in one portal. So you can choose the like maybe country, and then you customize the products, like can I say cereals. Then you can check how the duties to the targeted nations. And you can also find in this portal, you can also access to a lot of education modules. As UNCTAD provides, Korean also provides a lot of education modules. You can access, it is open to everybody, so you can, even if it is Korean, but it is very open to everybody. There's just a lot of like online training courses, as you can see here. There's FTAs and rules of origins. So a lot of information is in there. And also there is a call center is also linked here. To be frank, I also use the call center when I working if you very confused about some specific facts or regulations, I just called, well, what is all about? And they provides a very detailed kind explanation to the stakeholders. Yes, that's all what I prepared today. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sigyoung. It was quite interesting to hear Korea's experience. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Van Grastek. He's our discussant, so he will tell us what he thinks after these 3 interventions, and maybe he will ask some questions. Craig.
Well, thank you very much, Ebru. And yes, I would especially like to pose a few questions. Let me first start by complimenting the speakers on very comprehensive presentation. There are quite a number of points with which I'd like to associate myself, but I'd especially like to start directly after Jin-kyung, because there were so many points she made that I think really help us to elaborate on why implementation matters and why compliance matters. And I think this is a very important point that Jin-kyung was making, was we need to think about the larger picture of why we are negotiating trade agreements in the first place. And here, let me also comment a bit on what Professor Luke had to say, which is, I'm going to speak as if we are not purely transactional. I'm going to speak as if we are in the system that we had a year ago, because I hope we will get back to that at some point, and it's not merely a matter of finding out what is the current wreckage and what it is we're being obliged to do as a consequence of individual whim. But let's assume for the moment that we are existing in a system of the rule of law. Why do we care about compliance? We care about our own compliance and other countries' compliance because we want to establish confidence. We want to establish confidence on the part of the private sector that they can trade and invest in the knowledge that this will take place within a rules-based structure where there are not big surprises down the road, where there are not transactional surprises down the road. And I think compliance is a two-way street. We need to be very concerned that the commitments that our partners have made, they are going to be in compliance with them. We also have to be certain that the commitments we make, we are in compliance with them. Because if we make a commitment and we do not keep that commitment, a couple of things will happen. One is our private sector and the other country's private sector will not have that confidence and may not engage in the trade and investment behavior that we're trying to stimulate as a consequence of these agreements. But also, our negotiating partners are not going to trust us in the future. So if we reach an agreement and we are not in compliance with that agreement, that may be the last agreement that anyone is willing to meet us on. So let me start with that point. And as I say, I fully agree with what Jin-kyung had to say, or imply at least, in that regard. Let me pose a few questions. And I want to start by posing general questions for each of the speakers, and then turn to some of the more specific points that they each made. So one thing that I find very useful in discussing compliance is the experience of individual countries, of how they go about trying to ensure, again, their partners' compliance, but also their own compliance. And here, let me contrast the experience that I had in 2 countries that I did some work in for UNCTAD a number of years ago. And I won't name the countries, doesn't matter. I don't want to insult anybody, but these are 2 countries that had very different approaches to the topic. And one was a country that exemplified the points of what can go wrong if you have the disconnect between your negotiators and your regulators. This getting back to a very essential point that Guillermo was making, that there's a different mental universe in which negotiators exist and regulators, or also lawmakers, legislators, which is we make commitments that we expect them to comply with. They often are surprised that we are making commitments in areas that they thought were within their jurisdiction. And one of the worst ways that you can deal with the disconnect between the negotiators on the one hand and the regulators or lawmakers on the other is for them simply to ignore one another. So in one country that I was doing some work in which UNCTAD asked me to help that country write its trade strategy, I took a look at the commitments that that country had made in the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And that country had made a lot of very detailed commitments of what it would not do in the future. And of countries within that region, it probably made more commitments than any other. And then I looked at the laws that that country had enacted over the previous 10 years, anything involving the services sector, and I collected copies of those laws. I found at least half a dozen laws that were very blatantly out of compliance with the country's commitments. And I was the first one who was put in the uncomfortable position of explaining to people in that country how they had managed to make very deep commitments on the one hand and be so thoroughly out of compliance with them on the other. Luckily, we were able to do this in a way that was not public, that was not going to embarrass the country because it was a consultant's report to the government. That's a lot better than it showing up in the dispute settlement system in the WTO, for example. So that was one country. The next country I went to work in, and doing essentially the same type of project, helping the country to write its trade strategy, I was a little concerned, was I going to encounter the same type of problem? No, I did not. And the reason I did not was that country had established what Jinkung was calling a focal point, the type of inter-ministerial and inter-branch coordinating body, so that you would have both discussion between ministries and discussion between the executive branch of the government and the legislative branch of the government. And so when the legislature was thinking about enacting legislation in areas that were trade related, and getting back to one of Guillermo's original points, or getting back to one of Luzma's original points, what we define as trade related is much broader than it used to be. So in practically any economic and in a number of non-economic areas, when the country was considering new legislation, the responsibility of this body was to compare it to what its commitments had been in the WTO and in other trade agreements. So my question to each of the speakers is, do you have any experience that either conforms to the first example I was giving or conforms to the second example I'm giving here? Can you point to lessons that we can help to impart to the participants on either what not to do or whether you have more positive experiences of what to do? Getting back to a fundamental point I always like to make, which is trade policy making ultimately is about internal communications. And if you don't communicate properly internally, you don't negotiate well, you don't implement well, and you do not come into compliance properly. But if any of you have examples that you can help us to build on as lessons learned for the participants, that would be useful. Second broad question. Have you, in your experience, found the trade policy review process of the WTO to be useful? I noticed that in Jinkung's presentation, in the reference to knowing oneself, I believe I saw Confucius. It's a very Confucian idea, but it's also a very Western idea that you should know yourself. And one of the best ways to know yourself is not only self-examination, but within the WTO system, the trade policy review process, I have found, having participated in it with a number of countries, is a very useful way of countries on a periodic basis to do a kind of self-examination. I had the opportunity, being hired by the WTO, to help write the Secretariat report for a number of countries in the trade policy review process. And one thing that I consistently found in the countries that I was dealing with was we were helping them to unearth things they did not know about themselves. Now, I found very interesting Professor Luke's comments about working within coalitions. A specific question when it comes to trade policy reviews is, do you think, any one of you in the speakers, is it useful to do what some countries do if you outsource your trade policy making to a regional body? Should you also have your trade policy review conducted on a regional basis? And one of the things that I found in doing trade policy reviews is Those countries that group themselves together with others for purposes of trade policy making, it's very useful in a team building exercise and in understanding how one's regional organization works to have the TPRs done as well in that fashion, but relatively few countries do. So the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, for example, does so. But most regional organizations do not do so. But so the general question I would have to each of you is, one, have you found trade policy reviews to be a useful means of dealing with one's own compliance and implementation of agreements? And would you recommend as well, if a country is working within a regional coalition, should its trade policy review be conducted in that way? By the way, also Jin Kyung referenced the African Trade Observatory. I found that to be a very useful institution. If any of you have comments to make about that or other institutional bodies that help to serve as focal points or means of communication between governments or between governments and private sectors in the area of compliance and implementation, that would be very useful. Third general comment, and something that no one mentioned, I think, so far today, is dispute settlement. When we talk about implementation and we talk about compliance, there are relatively non-coercive and relatively coercive ways of ensuring compliance. So, for example, the trade policy reviews within the WTO context are considered part of the compliance insurance process, but they are non-confrontational. Dispute settlement is a more confrontational way of ensuring compliance. So to what extent are countries prepared to engage in dispute settlement when necessary? One of the things that I like to do in my own work is I take a look at who uses dispute settlement, who brings complaints against others, against whom are complaints brought. And one of the things we consistently find is dispute settlement tends to be used much more by the larger, more economically advanced countries. Developing countries much less frequently are the complainants in the process. The question is, should they be complainants more often? Is dispute settlement an underutilized aspect of compliance and implementation? Or in fact, would it be better to avoid dispute settlement as a means of enforcing countries' commitments? Those are the general questions. A few more specific comments and questions that arose as people were speaking. I was very interested in Guillermo's comments about dealing with the United States, dealing with the US Congress. This relates to an issue that arose in our last webinar, in which Luz Maria was referring to how our trade negotiations are taking place in, again, the same way that Professor Luke had mentioned, in a two-level process, in the two-tier process, where we negotiate within our countries and we negotiate between countries. But there's sort of a third tier, which is the negotiating ourselves as negotiators, dealing with the other countries' policymakers below the level of negotiators. That is to say, dealing with the US Congress, dealing with another legislative body, dealing with the regulatory bodies in another country. And when Luz Maria made reference to that in our previous discussion, I said that this to me is a way that the world has changed in the last 40 years. When I first started working in Latin America, it was considered to be a serious breach of protocol, a serious breach of etiquette diplomatically for negotiators in one country to deal with anyone in the other country who was not themselves a negotiator. Guillermo, if you have anything to say about how you may have seen changes in that sense over time of levels of political sensitivity, or to what extent it may now be more allowed for us to have those types of contacts in the first place, I always find that to be an interesting area of inquiry. Professor Luke making reference to the private sector and ownership. This is, to me, one of the most consistent problems I find in dealing with countries when trying to help them write, for example, a trade strategy. In almost every country in the world, there is an inadequate level of coordination between the public and private sectors, and getting private sector involvement and private sector ownership and coordination and cooperation with the government is a problem everywhere. Generally speaking, if any of you have positive examples to give of what you think may be best practices in trying to encourage greater ownership on the part of the private sector, greater at least participation in the process, I think we would all benefit. I certainly would. And then the last comment I would make is when Jinkyung was referring to the different ways that international law is reflected in the domestic law of countries. This, of course, is a topic on which the legal experts will explain to us in some depth how there are differences between countries with regard to the organic incorporation of international law in domestic law. We have different legal theories in different countries, and this is a point on which we could get well into the weeds. But I want to extract from what Jinkyung was discussing there to the larger problem, of which this is an example, which is bounded rationality. Bounded rationality in negotiations is that process by which we assume that our interlocutor, that the person with whom we are engaging, thinks about the world in the same way that we do. If we make the assumption that domestic law is related to international law in another country in exactly the same way that it is in our own country, we can end up making legal errors in our negotiations. If we assume in dealing with another party that the type of negotiating strategy that works when I'm dealing with a person from my own culture, from my own language, from my own country is going to work in the same way with them, likewise, we can get into a problem. So just as a general question, as a general point, what have each of you found to be useful ways of overcoming the problem of bounded rationality when dealing with people from other cultures? What are there any general rules that you think would be useful to impart to our participants? So I just wanted to be rather quick in responding and presenting some questions. I'll turn the floor back to Ebru.
Thank you, Craig. That's a lot of questions for our speakers. So let's start. Ambassador Valles, can we start with you?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. And particularly Craig with this last reflections and immediate questions. By the way, I lost the one I lost the one directed to me. If you could repeat it very briefly. I lost the questioning part, not the reasoning before that.
Oh, well, the question being any reflection you might have on, you and I have been in this business about the same period of time. Would you agree that over the last generation, there has been a fundamental change in what is considered diplomatically and politically acceptable in the degree of contact and negotiation as between the negotiators from country A and policymakers who are not negotiators in country B? Has there been a shift in that respect? And in what way should this inform how we as policymakers, how we as negotiators may relate to our interlocutors?
Good, good. Thank you very much, Craig. Let me start in the order you presented the general questions and the specific one, which I now understand. And by way of answering, I will also refer to some of the considerations made by David in particular, which I find extremely interesting. First, and this links again implementation with negotiations. Regarding the matter of the private sector, and this relates directly to the first question that you asked us about what were our experiences in negotiate in terms of the implementation. While you are negotiating, and if you take into account the private sector again, mindset there. The mindset of the private sector, it's completely different from the negotiator, and therefore it will also affect the implementation. Private sector, all what it is about, it's about, in my view, it's about competitiveness and market access, whether market access in a foreign country or market access being given in a very mercantilistic way. The sort of transactional mindset is more present, sometimes naturally, in the private sector than in the regulators, even in the past decades, I would say. So yes, the complexity of coordination, but also in terms of implementation, is that those who feel in the private sector that they have lost, quote unquote, some sort of monopolistic or oligopolistic opportunities that they had in their own countries, they will try during the implementation process to be a sort of a negative element to it. That would expand, that will be lobbying permanently for, in particular, new non-tariff measures to be imposed. That would be present until the sort of public good of an international negotiation, it's more evident to them. The short-term interests that David was referring will be permanent in the private sector, and the lobbying for complicated implementation could be present, depending on the balance of interest and the kind of success that you reached in the negotiation. All negotiations, all concluded negotiations, it's as we all know, it's a quite of a, I would say, generalizations of insatisfaction. The degree of insatisfaction varies, but it tends to be bigger, as I see it in my own experience in the private sector, and particularly in negotiations that involve multi-sectors, different sectors of very different sectors of economy. The usual question at the end of a negotiation is, why should I pay? I should pay in terms of my market, domestic market, for another branch of the economy. That that is very, very difficult to overcome, even during the implementation phase. And we have to acknowledge that. In terms of implementation, that will be the challenge. No matter how much bona fide there is in the negotiation, it will stand as a lobby. So, number one, my experience, Craig, was relative to my country was quite positive. I mean, it is in our anthem, and we sort of recitate that permanently. We will comply, we will comply. Sabremos cumplir, sabremos cumplir. That's the, you know, the kind of idea, and that's why we have some relatively, at least, a good a good record in terms of respecting what we agreed to. We are far from perfect, but I think we have not been sort of challenged so much in terms of respecting the rules that we agreed to. So that in terms of responding to your question. Coalitions, by the way, coalitions, and you referred to that as well. Coalitions, yes and no, David. Yes, I mean, I see it through the filter of the Mercosur, and it's a quite a challenging one, because we are supposed to have a customs union, and customs unions supposed to have a common trade policy, but we are extremely, extremely distant from that reality. To start with, because we are four countries absolutely asymmetrical in all terms. And number two, because in order to have a common trade policy, you first and foremost have to have a better coordination of macroeconomic policies. And to have coordination of macroeconomic policies among 4 countries with these asymmetries, it's extremely difficult. Economic cycles are completely different. Defensive and offensive interests are completely different. But most importantly of that, it's that you don't have the legal system to have a macroeconomic coordination, because we don't have supranationalism. Deeper agreements require deeper macroeconomic coordination, or you will face important problems later on of implementation. Let me give you one example. 1990, we signed the Mercosur agreement in 1991, and we were expecting to have the customs union by 1995. Among 4 countries with such asymmetries, only 4 countries, such asymmetries. And the customs union, you don't construct it definitely in 4 years, or more precisely 3 years, 9 months, and 5 days, as we were required to do it. Now, that affected not only internally the regional agreement and the regional negotiations and the regional implementation with all sorts of flexibilities, but also our external negotiations. So coalitions can help, but sometimes, and this is the example that I can give from Mercosur at least, it's that when you have the flexibilities, you have a common chapeau, but the flexibilities for each of the countries to negotiate externally, and the best example, Luz Maria, was our negotiations with Mexico. When we had a sort of a common chapeau, but actually we negotiated individually, it was not the coalition that helped, but actually the fragmentation, so to speak, of that negotiation into the 4 realities of the different countries, of course, respecting certain common rules. So that's my example, Craig. Now, in terms of what helps, definitely the TPR review process helps, because every 4 years or every 5 years, every certain period of time, you must have all the bodies together to see if the general rules, at least accorded in the WTO GATT system, are well implemented or not. And that therefore exercises the regulators to sort of be aware not only of the multilateral system, but also about the bilateral and regional agreements that we might have reached. So the exercising. But I would say even more, Craig, it's not only the TPR, but the other instruments of transparency that we have in WTO really help in the implementation of other, even bilateral agreements. I would make the case. Why? Take the example of services, for example. I mean, most of not all certainly, and I don't pretend to know to have such an expanded view, but many of the developing countries, what they have agreed to in the services agreement and the services schedules in WTO have also been sort of reflected, at least in their own bilateral and regional agreements. Why was that? Because in the case, at least this is my experience with many developing countries, I can remember that there were not too many regulations. We were coming from a quite open economy in terms of services, And therefore, what was agreed to by joining WTO or by participating in the UI round outcome of the services agreement was later on more or less the same sort of playing field that you had bilaterally with other countries as well. Therefore, the instruments of transparency in terms of regulations, in terms of notifications, also help. So WTO structure, not only TPR, I would make the case, also helps in the implementation process. You ask a very, very important question regarding dispute settlement. And again, let me show the case of Mercosur. We almost stopped having any kind of dispute since, if I'm not wrong, 2010. Now, does that reflect that the trade is a trade policy and the exchange of goods and services is absolutely perfect? Well, definitely not. So I don't know what's the reality in other countries, but I have seen this also in other Latin American experiences, particularly in South America. The number of disputes that would be absolutely normal in between partners, between economies that have a great exchange of goods, particularly, should be a normal thing. Well, most of the countries rely, and there's a question to be asked and an answer also there. Why is it that we rely more on sort of political settlements for trade disputes? Is it that the trade disputes mechanism doesn't work well? Or is it that by some other factors, we think that it's more, is less offensive, less, I would say, yes, offensive or aggressive to have a political solution for what it's a trade dispute instead of finding the normal usage of the legal system as the more pacific and the more sort of sustainable, even politically sustainable way of solving the disputes or the differences. The reality is there. The statistics are there. In my view, for some reason, at least in Latin America, we tend to think that the political solutions are easier, which is clearly not the case. At least this is my own experience. And it's not sustainable because changes of government, changes of approaches take place. Last but not least, your question about the reality. Definitely, it has changed, Greg, over time. And I would say the experience, as it was also mentioned at the very beginning, the experience of regulators, the experience throughout the time, but that was, and this is my biggest concern, Craig, about the times that we are now living in, that was under the idea that international cooperation, that negotiating policy space was good for everyone, that there was nothing wrong, there was no loss of sovereignty by negotiating. And that has completely changed, I think, hopefully not everywhere, but it's affecting all of us. And it's coming from the ones, the owners of the blueprint of the international system, which is the United States of America. And I'm not certainly representing my country in what I'm saying now. It's Guillermo Valles speaking. But when the paradigm of international cooperation is changed in the manner that it's being changed these days, without knowing what would be the repercussions in other countries and what would be the change of that mindset in other countries, everything can change. And therefore, the progress that we had in terms of awareness of beauties, let's put it that way in a very romantic manner, of public goods being completely lost, becoming now participants of a very transactional, mercantilistic, and in my way of seeing, primitive approach to trade policy, to trade policy, and to the trade policy system. Miho taught me that a long time ago. When we talk about trade, we should be knowledgeable of what we are talking about. Trade policy, and international trading system, it's quite different. But all of it is being changed by this change of paradigm. And therefore, the advantages and the knowledge and the experiences that we have accumulated collectively over the last, 20 years might be very quickly being lost. Sorry for being a little bit too long.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Valles, for these very insightful comments. And now we can invite Professor Luc for his answers to Craig's questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ibru, and also thanks to Craig for these interesting observations and questions. I'll begin with just a quick comment on the points that Yim Young made in regard to compliance. I also found the presentation very interesting, and actually would be very much interested in receiving a copy of it to look at it more closely. I hope that's possible, and Yim Young is able to share intellectual property, so to say, in that respect. So I'd like to see that. And then, yes, again, looking at compliance and various ways and means, relating this now to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, a great effort has been made to put in place a number of instruments that could help countries comply. Certainly, the Trade Observatory was mentioned, but beyond the Trade Observatory, there is also an electronic tariff book. There's a NTB mechanism for reporting on MTBs. There's effort to develop a Pan-African payment system where countries can use national currencies. And this speaks to also some of the challenges of that countries face. I think Guillermo also touched on this in some way, where you have different countries and different economic cycles, economies, and so on. But the Pan-African payment system, again, is an innovation that is meant to help to ease the payments between countries trading with each other, and of course help the private sector in that regard. There's also an adjustment fund as tariffs are cut and the loss of revenue and those sorts of issues, again, to assist with compliance and implementation. And then another innovation is an automotive fund. And the thinking here is that this AFCFTA agreement is meant also to drive industrial development, and the automotive sector is identified as a key sector with the possibility of a network of supply chains across the continent, from the minerals, raw materials, and so on, that part of the automotive value chain. And so this automotive fund is that is managed by the African Export-Import Bank, Afrexim Bank. I believe it's about $1 billion. Is meant to support the development of an automotive sector and the regional hubs. I think they're talking about at least 3 regional hubs, one in Southern Africa, around South Africa, which already is a major producer of automotive parts and vehicles. Another one in North Africa, around Morocco, that is also a major producer. A third one around Nigeria, that's a large market and also has a history of automotive sector. And then possibly also in East Africa, around Kenya, where we're beginning to see some production of both automotive parts and vehicles and so on, and relatively small scale. But again, using this agreement for this purpose and also to drawing the private sector to engage in a transformative way. Let me also just make the point that, and I think Guillermo touched on this, that in implementing trade agreements, there are inevitably trade-offs. Some sectors are going to grow and prosper from an agreement, and other sectors are going to feel challenged. And I think sometimes we're not very clear about these trade-offs. And I think implementation compliance also needs to take this into account. Also, as regards the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's been this guided trade initiative, which is, if you like, a pilot phase that is now transitioning into implementing the full agreement. And so even that pilot phase, this guided trade initiative, again, is to test implementation, to test compliance, to, as it were, as in any pilot, try to see what the problem areas might be and how to address them, so to say. Still on the AfCFTA, there is currently some discussions going on about borrowing from the WTO. This idea of a trade policy review process. This has been talked about and and is being looked into as to how it could be designed for an African agreement, recognizing also that many of the same countries participate in the WTO process, which, by the way, remains one of the, I think we could all agree, a strongly performing area of the WTO. So there's those discussions going on about borrowing the insights and the procedure from the WTO process. But here, yes, I think I could give at least two examples where countries have been reviewed as a coalition. I do believe the East African Community countries have been reviewed as a coalition, and also the SACU countries, the Southern African Customs Union countries. And I think those reviews have highlighted development, especially development challenges. And it's also true to say that some bilateral partners, I can think of the EU, has looked at ways in which its development cooperation could be shaped to respond to issues that came out of those reviews. So I think we have some experience of that. When it comes to dispute settlement, again, I agree with everything that's been said so by Guillermo on this. But I think this, for my book, How Africa Trades, we did look at this very closely. And in our chapter on the WTO, we looked at, yes, the data on compliance, complainants and respondents, African countries acting in those roles. Is very few. But we found that there's a longer list of countries that participate in the dispute settlement process as third-party observers. And I think there's a reason for this, because the system of using retaliation is not something that poor countries, can find themselves getting into. That's one aspect, just the way that the system is designed. It's also an expensive system in terms of putting together all the elements or making the case and so on. But nonetheless, if you look at the data, there's a long list of countries that are listed as having an interest in the dispute and as a third party and interested in the outcome. So you have that as well. And so it's something not to overlook. Then as regards, and I think I'll stop here, the issue about irrationality. I think the best example of that, ironically, is now the US trade policy makers, who seem to be really myopic in terms of how they could engage with the rest of the world, and what the alternatives might be to get more or less the same outcomes that US would like to get from international trade. So I think that's probably today's best example of bounded rationality. But not to be facetious, let me give another one, which is a very interesting one, and that is a big effort by China to uh, uh, open up for imports from African countries, and extended its least developed country. Um, what's the phrase now? It's the concession for LDCs, to
Duty-free, quota-free
the DFQF,
system schemes.
exactly, the DFQF. Thank you, Ebro. You're on top of it, and you have to be because you're in the International Trade Department, Doctor. Yeah, so China expanded its DFQF and so on, but then tightened its customs oversight of especially SPS and all those sorts of rules, and cases of containers of avocados that were sent to China being sent back and so on. And they had to reverse that. And that's how they instituted what they call these green lanes for these products from these countries. So again, another example of how bounded rationality could play out. But thanks for all these comments. Again, very interesting, insightful, and myself, we are learning every day. I mean, even if we've been in this game for so long, but yeah, just finding all of these exchanges very insightful and very helpful. As I said at the very beginning, that the slides that Jim Young shared certainly provided some, strong insights on implementation and compliance. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Luke. It's a very interesting debate, so I did not dare interrupting our speakers. We are beyond time actually, but we still have everyone on board, so thank you very much. And I would like to turn to my colleague Jin Young for her final remarks.
Okay, thank you, Ibra. Because we're behind the schedule, so I'll try to very brief. Getting back to the first question, yes, the coordination is very important, and internal ministerial, what can I say, body is crucial. From my personal experience, without this ministerial coordination meeting in Korea, we can't go forward. Because as distinguished speakers said, regulators and lawmakers and the trade negotiators have a different mindset. So it is really important from the experience of Korea, we also have before the important round of negotiation, we also go through this ministerial meeting because we have to have a kind of mandate that we can deal with and negotiate with. So it is really, really important. As His Excellency Mr. Baez said, this meeting is for kind of, I think, process to find a better future for the country, because negotiation is a tool, not a purpose, the final purpose. And I think through this internal coordination, you can do a structural reform and economic development strategy. Through this coordination meeting and through this process you can find. I think negotiation is just a tool to develop your country. So internal coordination is very important in Korea. We have regulations regarding the ministerial meeting on international economic affairs. It is established by law and regulations, so we fully utilize as a negotiators when we do negotiate. It's very important. As the second WTO review process, yes, it is very, very would be helpful because we can't review bilateral regional trade negotiation from the scratch because of the limited resources. So we can use the WTO and also UNCTAD. UNCTAD have a trains, which is a NTM database. There are a lot of data there, so we can identify which country has which NTMs, blah, blah, blah. So we don't need to make everything from the zero. We can utilize the data which is already over there. So United States, United Nations is very working hard on this, and the WTO is also there, so we can use that. But this could not be a perfect substitute for when it comes to bilateral agreement, because in assessment of bilateral agreements, this is consists of two parts, which is quantitative review assessment and qualitative review. In terms of quantitative review, we always we assess the tariff reduction impact, so which is not covered by the multilateral scheme. So, but anyhow, it is very important to use UNCTAD and WTO. And the third question, the bounded rationality. In order to overcome the boundary, I think what matters is communication and consultation. The important thing is to know that you might not know. So always try to reach out the other party and the stakeholders, and yeah, always try to be open. So I think other than that, I can't think of any good ways to overcome the bounded rationality. The next question was dispute settlements. It was well addressed by other speakers, but yeah, I fully agree. There could be some problem with the dispute settlement system itself. Maybe it could not be efficient enough for countries to use that. But also, I'd like to emphasize that capacity building and expertise. When we encounter a kind of dispute, it necessitates a lot of legal expertise, kind of legal argument, right? So I think if the underdeveloped or developing countries are using last the dispute settlement, I would imagine that because of capacity problem, because it is very sophisticated, very professional process. So I think that would be one problem. So as Professor Luke said, by participating the third party participation, you can build up your capacity, because you can just see how the procedure is going on, and so we can utilize it. Also, in a general term, every dispute settlement, domestically and internationally, always time and money consuming. So peoples are have a tendency to not to go far to the point that of dispute settlement, because it's too offensive, right? So because between countries there are lots of bilateral trade issues, but we don't bring all the issues to the dispute level. The issues that is to bring to the dispute level is very, very rare. So typically we just do communicate, and so almost everything is dissolved under that level, but the world is changing, so I don't know it would work as well these days, but we'll have to try, I think. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shin-Kyung. Well, thank you all very much, our distinguished speakers. That was a very interesting discussion. We went 20 minutes beyond our time, but we had a lot of participants, still 74. We are all 74 all together. So thank you very much for your insightful interventions. And this webinar is the last of the webinar series we were organizing within the UNCTAD online course on trade negotiation techniques. I think for this year, we are closing the series with this webinar, and I hope it was useful. And I would like to thank everyone for your participation and your attention and your time. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you. Good day.
Thank you.